So that's why it was why I was saying that. Okay, so I'll
Yeah.
share my screen and let me see if I can make this there we go. So, hi again, everybody. I am Robin Austin. I am an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota School of Nursing. I'm also our director for the Center for Nursing Informatics. And this presentation will kind of be a blend of a lot of my backgrounds. And so I'm hoping that this is informative. And I also want to have a time for discussion and dialogue at the end as well. So my title is Empowering Progress, Advancing Women's Health Through Data and oops, I can't see my screen here, and I should know policy. There's been some policy in 2024, and so we'll see what sticks and what might not stick going forward, but looking forward to a great conversation. So again, just a little bit of background. I'm also, so I'm faculty in the School of Nursing, but I'm also graduate faculty in the Center for Spirituality and Healing. And just this past year, I had applied for the Menopause Society. They were having a 2-year research mentorship program. And just, I'll tell my story around how I kind of got into this in this specific area of field is just for my own personal wanting to know more about it personally. And then a lot of my friends were having some discussions and conversations, and I thought, well, I can dive in and look at this. And then when I saw the research mentorship program, I thought, well, this is a great way to really get linked in with that community that's doing research in this area. As we'll talk about, there's really a huge gap, as we know. So my proposal was really to look at examining the use of data, specifically around menopause, but electronic health record data, and how is that or not being represented as we're trying to use data for research, but it's not really easily extractable. But also looking at things from a whole person perspective and also mind body approaches to menopause as well. And my mentor is from the San Francisco VA, and she leads their women's health program at the VA as well. So she's been doing this work for quite a long time. So our objectives are just to look at analyzing trends that are happening right now, specifically focusing on menopause, identifying gaps and areas for improvement, discuss current research that I've been diving into as well. I'd love to get your feedback and just other areas that you might have feedback or interest in as well. And then current policies. So we always look at the research, but then what are the policies behind driving some of our practices or trying to identify some of those gaps? And some interesting things have been coming out, and we're just, again, I'm really hoping that things stick, but we'll see. So looking at menopause, I went to the Menopause Society conference last fall, and the biggest takeaway I had from that conference is that menopause itself and women's health in general, major data problem. And so there's a gap in understanding about women's health, specifically those conditions that directly affect women, which is menopause, is what I typically tend to have been focusing on. As we know, it's a major universal experience, over 51 of the percent of the population, but also the fact that they're trying to look at it from an economic perspective is that women drive the global economy and are vital to the global workforce. And so how does this midlife and postmenopausal impact the economic workforce and the economic global development? And so they've done some really interesting papers that I can share. And one of them is called the McKinsey report. And you can see the title up above here, which is Closing the Women's Health Gap, a 1 trillion opportunity to improve lives and economies. And here's another cover of it down below as well. But they're estimating by 2030 that 1.2 billion women worldwide will be in menopause or postmenopausal phase. It's 47 million entering more each year. And really being able to focus on specifically the data and the policy components for a major underserved milestone in this women's in our lives. And we really need to be able to tackle these to meet some of these the health consequences of menopause and being in postmenopausal as well. And so what kind of drove why menopause? And so for my personal understanding was I just started looking to try to find information for myself and some of my friends. And I really couldn't find a whole lot. And I'm like, well, what is this? There's a huge gap. And there's like I could not find the things that I wanted to look for. As you know, we're nurses, we tend to go and find what's in the literature, what's evidence-based. And I just kept coming up with like not a whole lot. Then at that same time I was looking, there was more evidence coming out around the previous report around the Women's Health Initiative in 2002. And now they're going back and looking at some of that data and really realizing that some of those results may have been misinterpreted, which leaving now a significant gap in understanding about menopause and the knowledge around it and major and women without effective relief essentially as well. We now have much better research that's coming out really in the last couple of years The growing awareness of long-term health effects of menopause and the decreasing of estrogen. It's on everything. It's on cardiovascular systems, brain health, our musculoskeletal, now it's called musculoskeletal syndrome of menopause, our bone health and osteoporosis. I mean, I just kept reading all of these stats and I was like, why are we not screaming this any louder than we possibly can? Also metabolic health, and didn't even mention mental health changes, things like that. So it's much more than what we were even understanding before, and the gap that we now have is seems astronomical, but I think there's some great work being done that we can hopefully close that faster than what we had thought originally. So really just to kind of level set in what I mean when we're talking about perimenopause and menopause, things like that. And I didn't even know there was a thing called menopause transition when I started looking. But really this can start into your mid 40s. And so speaking with some of my family members and even my close friends, I'm like, no, this is like now, like this is ongoing, and you can be having things way much earlier than what we are even anticipating, and to not ignore things and to really go in and get checked out. I mean, as nurses, I think sometimes we're our own worst patients, but I think it's really something to be understanding of what this transition really means and how we can really advocate for ourselves and each other during this time. So the menopause transition really, I didn't realize could be 8 to 10 years potentially as well. And so there's lots of things that women are experiencing that may or just kind of say, whatever, but there are things we can do. And so that's kind of what my whole big message was, is trying to really get some of this information out. And then the definition of menopause, which I also didn't realize, was the permanent cessation of menses and the loss of ovarian function, or it could be due to surgical or medical intervention as well. But it's the 12 consecutive months of amenorrhea that you finally say that you're in menopause. But the average age is around 51.2, and then the menopause transition can be 8 to 10 years prior to that as well. So even throughout your 40s. But I've seen different ages, average age of menopause. I've seen it 52, I've seen it 50.4. It averages out, it just depending on your biology as well. But the menopause symptoms too are vast, and they can be, again, you've seen one, because everybody is so different and so unique in how they experience things. And some people have a lot harder time, and a lot of people are just like, well, I don't really notice anything at all. But that's okay. It just that understanding what some of these symptoms are, and specifically the sleeping issues that we might experience, mental health, vasomotor symptoms or hot flashes. 80% of women reporting menopause disrupts daily life. And I'll equate some of this, of why it's also, I think, a big discussion for the nursing profession as well. And then again, 1/3 experiencing depression. There are differences between racial and ethnic groups. But then on top of it, hormone prescribing therapies are really, really low. It's about 4 to 6%. And than that, if people are so interested in having that kind of a therapy, if they're able to, and low risk enough as well. But they're finding that there's much better data out there now than what we originally had with the original Women's Health Initiative in 2002. You can see the picture here. So again, night sweats are just hot flashes during the day. At night, mood changes, low energy, brain fog is what we've also had. So I think I just got my internet was unstable, so hopefully I didn't pause there. But you can see the slides are vast, or the symptoms are vast. And what I wanted to bring this and discuss as well is the impact on our work. And so they're looking at this from an economic perspective as well. So, and I was equating it. So what's the average age of menopause? Is around 51.2 or 50, somewhere in there. What's the average age of our nursing workforce? And we have, this is 4.7, but I think it's higher than that, of million nurses nationwide. And that's not even talking globally. I just was looking at US. But the average age is 47. And so when you layer that on top of what's happening with menopause transition, or experiencing potential symptoms, could be a major disruption with workforce. And so they're looking at it from that economic component of how can we help in the workforce, providing some resources, getting care that women need, and also feeling very supported in their jobs. So it says the statistic of 1 in 5 women leave their jobs due to menopause-related symptoms, I thought was staggering. I hadn't realized it was even that high, but I think it might even be it's impacting nurses potentially more, particularly those that might do night shift. We're linking some of the shift work to circadian rhythm, as you know, or sleep issues, potentially altering even some estrogen progesterone patterns, and potentially even irregular menses. But then there's one study I did find that looked at night shift working linked to earlier onset of menopause as well. And so more work to be done around that. But again, just the impact of this, and we're nursing shortage on top of that there's women are experiencing a major shift in their lives as well. And so how can we better as a profession support one another through all of this? And even our younger nurses, preparing them for maybe what might be to come, as well as those currently in the workforce. But they looked at the other figures down below as really just that cost of lost of work productivity. This isn't just related to nursing, but this was just in general. But I thought it was still staggering of the lost work productivity associated with menopause. They were able to actually be very, very specific. It's 1.8 billion annually. And then the medical costs, direct and indirect, related to menopause symptoms was 26 billion annually. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, obviously. And I have resources at the end of our presentation, and I can share these slides after the fact as well, but they do have some other initiatives going on specifically for resources in the workplace. And so we can maybe do a better job of distributing those to our employers, especially where there's a large chunk of nurses that work as well. I think would be wonderful. So just looking at just the menopause research specifically as well. So as I was getting ready for this presentation, I went into PubMed and I said, just if I put in the word menopause, how many articles come up? And I limited it to 2000 to 2025. So it's 25 years, which is pretty significant. And there was over 6,500 articles. But when I put in just the word diabetes from 2000 to 2025, there's over 78,000 articles. So just that alone, I think speaks volume to the amount of research being done or not done in menopause specifically. Again, this was just a quick look, and the picture up above was looking at the trends of menopause articles within PubMed, and I went from 1950 all the way to 2025. But it was just a good visual of the increase of research that's coming out in the last few years. But again, I think there's a huge catch up that we need to be doing in this space as well. And I've already spoken to the fact that there's a significant gap in not only just menopause, but I wanted to point out that there's other conditions specific to female, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome. There's migraine research being done, just things that are much more we know that are show up differently in women specifically as well, that needs to be conducted. And the other point of all of this as well is one of the papers I had read was that women spend an average of 9 years in poorer health. And mainly a lot of the research being done focuses on some of those diseases that are higher mortality, not the diseases that may cause more leading to disability, such as mental health or menopause or some of the other factors as well. But I think that there's hopefully looking to be more of a shift. And I did see a few calls specifically from the National Institute of Health looking at some of these diseases that are more female specific or women specific, and also leading to disability, not just that high mortality rate as well. So hopefully more to come. Unfortunately, when some of this was coming out, we didn't have the cuts that we potentially have now with the NIH, which is a little bit scary and kind of throwing everybody into a little bit of a tizzy. But and we'll get to some of that with our policy. And again, I just you have to kind of wait and see how things play out. But I'm hoping that some of these initiatives that were started by the Biden administration will stick.
Hi, Robin. Can you hear
Yeah.
me?
Yeah.
This is Heidi. I'm so excited about this topic. So I work with employers every day as a clinical consultant,
Yes.
and the aging workforce and menopause is number one or two on their interest level this year. So this is really excellent information that I will take back to my groups. So thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. And I do have links at the end of this presentation as well, where I got some of those specific work site or helping your employer around understanding more about menopause and how to support the workforce. So hopefully that would be, and I think they're free. So yeah, hopefully that those are helpful. And reach out to me. I have my contact information at the end, and we can touch base if needed too.
Thanks.
Yeah, great. Yeah, feel free to interrupt. I want this to be a conversation and a dialogue, and I know that there's some chat going on. I just couldn't see it at the moment as well, but feel free to stop me anytime. So looking at some of these root causes of the gaps, just to kind of go back and for my own sake, I was like, okay, why did these even begin? We know about the Women's Health Initiative in 2002, but and you can probably know this already, is that some of the science really by default and the research is based on a male body, which can hinder our understanding of biological differences, resulting in fewer or less effective treatments, specifically looking at women and these specific, very understanding conditions or specific conditions to women. And looking at the health data, also, I think now that we're relying on data more and more for developing tools and technologies related to AI, I think that we need to have much better data than what we do to be able to design some of these tools effectively. I love technology. I kind of did a lot of my graduate training in informatics by background as a nurse. So I get that, but I think that still having a gap in some of this data makes me nervous. I think having some of these tools built on the current data that we have, I worry about that. But there's ways I'll show you that we can hopefully get that to be better over time. And then also care delivery. I think women face more barriers in care, delayed diagnoses, a suboptimal treatment, which isn't, we've heard of this before. But I think seeing some of it in writing and developing some interventions and tools that we're more aware of going forward will hopefully help us to combat some of these, what are the root causes of a lot of these gaps. I wanted to point out as well, a big topic that I've been interested lately, and some of you may know, is the misinformation. I think that when we saw some of just the last few weeks of some health sources being taken down from the internet or some other things that were happening on the national level, it made me very concerned, not only around social media, which is can spread like wildfire, but I think even looking back to COVID and how misinformation was being spread. And our Surgeon General a few years ago wrote a report out around confronting health information. I think just in looking at the gap in understanding about menopause is a prime position for there to be more misinformation being spread. We want to make sure women are getting the exact information that they need that is evidence based and of solid resources. And there was just today I saw, I think it was today or yesterday, a report that came out from the Alliance for Women's Health and Prevention that they had a preventative report that came out around just women in health, not necessarily related to menopause, but the gap of misinformation and really what healthcare providers are still a primary source. But this survey really pointed out that 60% of women, 66% of women surveyed said social media was also seen as a viable resource, which I get. I mean, I can understand that, but also the other staggering parts to that were that 39% of the women say that social media is a valuable source of information, seeking peer support in health issues, which it's an easy go-to. I understand that. But what was really starting to get a little bit concerning was that the third bullet point down was that 24% of women under the age of 50 say that health influencers are just as reliable as health providers, which was a little bit concerning, given the fact of how misinformation can spread. And I just, making sure that people have the correct information and accurate information when they can. But notably, the last bullet point, is 68% of women in this survey said that they have encountered confusing information on social media, which isn't too surprising. But to me, it speaks to the fact of we need to be very diligent about what we're reading online, how we're sharing information online. And I think a broader conversation at some point, not necessarily this presentation, but what is our role as nurses to combat misinformation, and how can we inform ourselves to understand what's real, how do we fact check what we're reading, and or if patients come to us and ask us questions, how do we have that conversation around potential misinformation? And so that's I had to throw that in there just because it's been on my mind the last few weeks as well. So, current research agenda for myself was when the Biden administration last year came out in March of 24, an executive order on women's health research and innovation. It was really exciting. I was kind of nerdy and I read almost the whole thing just because I was really curious to see what they were saying and how they were laying out some of these strategies. I wanted it to be tangible. I wanted it to have more not fact checking, but deadlines of when they were going to be getting some information or some of this work being done. But one thing that did catch my eye, being that I'm more of an informatics brain kind of technology background and understanding data, was in Section 5 of this executive order was that Section 5 called Galvanizing Research on Women's Midlife Health. So that, for one, kind of piqued my interest. But part of that was they were looking at considering developing new common data elements, which was really to support, I think, midlife health, making sure we have equitable data and the tools needed for collecting this data specifically around women's midlife health. And so my informatics brain was like, well, I can do something around that. I can help with that part of getting a better understanding and helping to fill that gap in women's health through appropriate data. So I was going to then I'm combining my informatics data science to really bridge this gap in women's health data. And I'll share some of the research we've been doing this last year around some of this topic. And I want to make sure I'm watching the time. Okay. So looking at menopause data, for example, is we do have, or there are menopause symptom checklists or surveys. And so I wanted to say, okay, what is common across all these checklists? What everybody kind of, collects data slightly differently, which is then harder to compare data later. And so is there a way we could standardize some of these checklists across organizations or across systems, just so we can start to have a better understanding across health systems and gathering better and bigger data on a systematized, standardized, structured way. And so I'm going to take a sip, sorry. And so we looked at these surveys. And then if you're familiar with the Omaha system, which is a standardized nursing terminology, we use that as our framework because it provides a very holistic view of health. And I think my internet just said unstable. Hopefully you can still hear me.
Yeah, we can still hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I think we took 6 or 7 menopause checklists and mapped them to the Omaha system as our standardized kind of structured terminology, as a way then to look at across things holistically to see where there might be gaps in some of these assessments. And I provided a structure for us to then maybe and kind of then come back and say, well, here's some commonalities between all of these checklists. And then could we then have that as common data elements or the starting point of our common data elements? So all of these, we found 77 menopause signs and symptoms, which is quite large, but is there a way over time that we can kind of start to narrow this down, getting feedback from clinicians out in practice, hearing from specifically midlife women, what is important to them as well, and then be able to recommend common data elements that everybody then will collect on over time and over systems. One thing we did notice within all of these checklists was that there's a gap of asking about environmental factors. There's some new research coming out around how our environment or potential toxins in the environment also impact menopause and hormones. And so is there a way that we could maybe add in some of those questions so we can start to track and trend over time potential exposures in our environment and how that might affect menopause long term? But that's, again, future work to come. And we just found out the paper was accepted. So to be determined, and I'll make sure I send that out once it is published. But we're really excited about that beginning work.
Robin, this is Heidi again.
Yeah.
I work in data as well.
Yeah.
And one thing that I'm finding this year is that amongst the employers who have opted into weight loss solutions, whether it's GLP-1s for weight loss or other programs for weight loss, 82% of the participants are women between the ages of 45 and 60. So that's coming. And so whenever I talk about weight loss solutions, I suggest, what are you doing for your menopausal women?
Yep, 100%. And that's a huge, another symptom or complaint is the metabolic changes that come with midlife. Yeah, I would agree 100% that they go hand in hand for sure. Yeah, great point. Yeah, another big topic. Another project that we recently are working on is I wanted to do some diving into the literature of how is menopause being documented in the electronic health record, if that's where people are gathering data to do some of their larger studies around symptom management or things related to menopause. How is it being documented? Because as I'm imagined, it's all over the board. And so there's not a consistent way we're even extracting data from the electronic health record. So primarily, we did a rapid review of the literature looking at how was menopause documented. And our preliminary results were looking mainly using ICD-9 and ICD-10 codes, not consistent across the studies, which isn't surprising. But I guess it gives us more insight into being able to decide on how we should structurize or maybe make recommendations to better document. But then those people that are doing research using electronic health record data, there were some claims data as well. But how can we then make sure that there are standardized processes for researchers? If you're going to be using EHR data, let's all try to gather it the same way, because then we can compare apples to apples then over time within the specific studies. The other reason I wanted to look into it is there a standardized way that they're documenting if, again, we're starting to gather maybe an AI solution or an algorithm or clinical decision support is based on this data, but it's done very differently across systems. So my big thing is really trying to standardize how this is being done so we can have better data on the back end to build some of these solutions. So that's one of the things. But the one thing we did identify was that the ICD-10, ICD-9 codes, but we realized that other symptoms overlap. And so maybe, for example, someone has heart palpitations that they went in for, and it's maybe related to menopause, but it's not even documented related to menopause. So how do we understand that linkage? And I think over time we can, but it's trying to dive in and looking at the nitty gritty details to have recommendations. And the other discrepancy we found within the literature was that either patients disclose maybe menopause symptoms, or that they concerned about menopause, or they were having symptoms related to menopause, or the provider documentation of symptoms if they were discussed. Those were two separate issues that were coming up as well. So I think the idea is that there's more education needs to be done for women, but also for health providers. And we've seen that in the literature as well, that some health providers have said, I was not taught this in medical school. I had like a module on it. And so I think there's a lot of education that needs to go around. And also, I think for the nursing profession as well, having some broader education would be fantastic. So future research really is looking at building an evidence-based guideline using standardized terminology, and I have myself and some colleagues are looking into this right now. Again, getting back to, could we have a broader evidence-based guideline that is, again, evidence-based, but also looking at what is the guideline here in the US, what are guidelines in Europe, what are guidelines in Australia, New Zealand, and really taking a global perspective at this. And so how could we look at things, again, creating those common data elements for all to use, so we're all collecting data very, very similarly, again, to really then be able to look at on a much better, bigger, broader scale of how these symptoms impact women over time. I think over time is the other key component, because we have some studies are just a snapshot in time, and we don't really have that longitudinal data that I think would be fantastic to be able to have and report on. Another project I'm working on is related to midlife women and chronic pain. We know that the musculoskeletal syndrome of menopause is real, but also midlife is a time where chronic pain conditions can be exacerbated. And so we're looking to potentially tailor a chronic pain mindfulness-based program specifically for midlife women. And that'll be coming sooner, that'll be on its way, but love to hear more feedback on that. And then, of course, I'm open to ideas and also partnership. And the next couple of slides I have are really looking at health policy. So the research side of things, but then I said, well, what's happening and how can we get better support for all of these things that's happening to over half the population? We have to be talking about this. And so I was able to attend the American Academy of the Health Policy Conference last fall. And one of the presenters, and this really, really resonated with me, was that she had said that nursing intervention at the society level is what health policy is. And I was like, oh, I get it. Like health policy was always one of those things over there for me. It was just kind of, we read about it. It was kind of off to the side. But when she said that, it really, really resonated that this is all within our wheelhouse. We all do nursing interventions. This just happens to be at the society level or the population level, which I thought, oh, that I get it. That really, really resonated with me. So I have to say, I can't take credit. I didn't say it. So this other presenter said it. But I think it's something that we all we can hang our hat on, and we can resonate with that. But there's some specific legislation that was that had being addressed last year. Don't know what's going to happen to it again going forward, but there's an organization called the Society for Women's Health Research, and they do a really good job. They're kind of a research and a policy kind of think tank specifically for women's health, and not just menopause. They do a lot of conditions. But they also have a legislation tracker on their website, which I thought was fantastic because it's not just policy around menopause, but I think they had some mental health, I think, policy, cervical cancer policy, things like that. But if you're interested in going to that website, I found it very helpful, just informative, just for my own sake. So that was the other piece of it. And then thus far on the website as well, the Biden administration, the executive order on women's health research and innovation, thus far had not been rescinded, whereas everything else from the previous administration has been. And but that was again like last week or 2 weeks ago now when we looked at it. So again, who knows? And hopefully, some of that will again stick. I'm hopeful. But I do want to point out two pieces of legislation specifically around menopause was the Advancing Menopause and Midlife Women's Health Act 2024. And this was introduced, and it's to improve menopause and midlife women's care. They were authorizing over $275 million over 5 years, which is it's a lot of money for a short period of time. Again, it's looking for the workforce, training the workforce, raising awareness, educational efforts, public health, all the things that we were kind of just mentioning. And it was a bipartisan, I think, bill and really supported bipartisanly. It was introduced in May of 24. We can be hopeful that this will continue to go, but yeah, it's out there, so you can find it's still on the docket. I found it still. The link was still there when I went to look. Another one is the Menopause Research and Equity Act of 2023. This bill would require the director of the NIH to really evaluate the results and the status of even completed or ongoing research to re-examine some of what we found from potentially the 2002 Women's Health Initiative, re-evaluate some of that data. I think might be with another critical eye, knowing what we know now, might be beneficial to really better understand some of those results. And to kind of fill in some of the gaps of what we had originally thought were maybe misinterpreted and how that could be redone and reevaluated. And so this was the other one looking at some of that. And I know that within the NIH, they have the Office of OWHR, so it's the Office of Women's Health Research. And they do a lot of work around, and not just within their own office in the NIH, but I think they called it like a transdisciplinary approach, meaning it's across all of the institutes. Again, how that might look going forward now, we don't know, but it's there, and they put a stake in the ground very strongly. So and they do have a lot of support. So hopefully some of this funding will stick around for that. And in conclusion is just I wanted to say that advocate now more than ever. I used to always think, well, advocate, I don't really know what to say, but I think now getting kind of informed myself about the facts and really looking at some of these statistics behind the scenes, it was like jaw dropping. And so not just there's other conditions that are just as jaw dropping. And so I think as a profession and as we have a huge, powerful voice, there's a lot of us. There's a lot of nurses, and I think that we can have that voice going forward. And I think now more than ever, it's even more and more important. And so also at the health policy conference last fall, Ernest Grant had said, quiet nurses rarely get anything done. And so I really liked that quote as well, just because it's true that I kind of would tend to sit in the back and I'll just sit and listen and maybe I'll speak up eventually. But really, I don't think we have time anymore to sit back. And so I think it's really the collective of us will be amazing to try to move some of these things forward, even when it doesn't seem right now maybe possible. But I think it's really an effort to try. And so my other question then leading to the group would be, what research would you like to see in women's health? It doesn't have to be menopause, but just love to hear your thoughts and other things. And I love the fact that there's more employers interested in this topic as well. And I'll share these resources. And this is the slide, and I can share these slides with everybody, and there should be the links would work in these slides as well. So the Society of Women's Health Research, they have a workplace resources guide, and then they also have the Menopause Society has Making Menopause Work. They have a whole host of resources as well. And then the and Andropause Society also came out with a very nice consensus global statement around recommendations for menopause in the workplace. These are all evidence, the sources that they do have are evidence-based, they're fact-checked, all of those kinds of things. And so I really feel very comfortable using a lot of these resources would be fantastic if you wanted to share those as well. So with that, I think it's almost 7:40, and there's my name and my email. Feel free to reach out to me, and I really appreciate your attention, and I'm happy to take questions. And there's my references as well. But Kathy, I can send you these slides if you'd like at the end.
You actually already had, and so I'll be able
Oh,
to.
that's right. Perfect. I may have added in one slide around the
Oh.
misinformation.
Okay, send me the new ones then.
Okay, I will.
This was great. I think, Heidi, are you still on?
I am, yep.
Maybe you could ask your question about ICD-9 codes and.
Yeah, I was very interested in kind of the, I guess, quest to follow some of the diagnoses that are associated with menopause. And I wonder if it would make sense to cast a broader net and look for the demographic of women between the ages of 45 and 60. And then as a researcher, try to kind of organize the multiple diagnoses that seem to be bubbling up.
Yeah, exactly. And that was something that was so when we were looking at him, it was just from what was published. But I have a colleague that said he has a potential data set that, and so all those questions, what you just mentioned, I think are we could use within this specific data set that he had. What are like specifically the age groups, looking at it from a coding perspective, I think would be fantastic just to see, again, like you said, what is out there. But then when they also, I realized one of the other questions that came up was when we were looking at ICD-9 codes and they went to ICD-10, there were less codes around menopause. And so is that there it's less granular? That's something to be looked at as well. I was like, it was raising more questions, but yes, I agree that definitely casting a wider net. We also realized in that rapid review, everybody had a different age limit or age group that they looked at for midlife women. So do we want to look at it from 35 to 55? Do we want to look at it from 40 to 60? What would that be? And so that's something else to be discussed. And then the other thing that we found, the colleague that I work with at the VA, when they were doing some of their work, is that there's very little documentation of, for example, the final menstrual period date. And so to find even just that was really, really challenging. So you're kind of going off of by proxy on how to identify it within electronic health record. Either it's age, or they were looking at were they prescribed a hormone therapy regimen, and so you're kind of like adding these kind of other variables as a proxy. So much work needs to be done on how to really clearly identify. And then I think it's education on documentation practices probably as well needs to go a part of that. But yeah, fascinating work.
Absolutely. And I think just like I said, the last probably 1 year, the employers are just raising their hand, like, how do we learn more? How do we support our women? And there are a couple of different virtual women's health care clinics you might be aware of, MIDI Health and Visana.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're just seeking to try to identify those, especially populations where there's a medical desert in general.
Yes.
But when you kind of layer on their menopausal specialists in South Dakota, for example,
Right.
there's maybe two. And so we're trying to figure out how can we reach a broader population with other solutions. So
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And I think that there's a lot we could use electronically if that's available to people. But then we also have that there's broadband deserts, there's things like that that maybe not be accessible digitally. And so you don't want to then create a further gap, all of those things. But I think it's going to be definitely feels like a multi-pronged approach, and not a one solution fits all. And as we know, that's just kind of also true of nursing intervention, right? You have to kind of tailor it to your population and where you are. But a lot more resources out there now that are bubbling up, which is fantastic. And then again, I worry that who is putting them out there? Is it for just commercial value in the dollar factor? Is it really evidence based? Things like that. So yeah, definitely more to come, and a lot of great research to hopefully come forward. So there's a lot of people working on this, which I also realized at the Menopause Society was it's a big group of people that really the clinicians and also researchers that are trying to solve this as fast as they can. So yeah,
Robin, it doesn't surprise me that you came up with 77 different symptoms.
yes,
Just recently, I was in a lunch group with 15 nurses, and we're all kind of the same age, and we all just said various different kinds of things, but I bet I could have come up with at least 25 different symptoms just within our group. So I do think that, yeah, it's a broad spectrum. The interesting thing that hadn't realized was the musculoskeletal kinds of things that people were talking about. Pains everywhere, or just so what you're doing is fantastic.
thank you.
And I think it would help a whole lot of a broad group of women that need to know this information.
Yeah, yep.
Menopause can be scary.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think I started looking at the musculoskeletal part because I was working with a group of pain researchers. And then they were looking at pain. I was like, well, pain is much higher in women. And why is it higher in women? And then you find like one article and then you find another article. And I'm like, oh my gosh, nobody's talking about this. What's happening? And then that specific, there's a specific article that came out last year specifically called the musculoskeletal syndrome of menopause. And I was like, oh my gosh, like why are we not saying this? Like why is this not in the news every night? you know, I find it fascinating, but I agree. It's starting to kind of peel back a lot of those layers, and the more we start digging, the more questions we ask, and I think will be the better value. And I think sharing broadly this information, like you just said, it's I talked to a couple of girlfriends of mine from high school, and that's all they're talking about. That's all we talk about is literally like menopause and what are you doing and how can I help and I can't sleep. And so I definitely think that there's lots of work to be done, and especially I think in our nursing workforce, being able to help one another through this as well would be fantastic.
No, I would like to just say it would be interesting to do focus groups with older women talking to younger women about how they manage their symptoms because older women have been through it and figured some things out. Oh, you're paused.
All right. She's thinking deeply about what you said, Lori. It's a good point, though. Were you able to hear Lori's comments?
I did not. Would you mind repeating it? I'm so sorry. I froze.
Just having older women who are at the other end and symptoms are subsiding, at talking to women starting or going through it and how they managed it so that they don't think, that this is just happening to them, having those chats,
Yep.
fireside chats.
Yep. Absolutely. I agree. I remember I was talking with my mom and some of my aunts, and I was like, did you know this? And they're like, well, yeah, but we never talked about it. Like,
Right.
and so I would agree. And she's like, this is very different than what we went through or experienced. And so I would agree having those opportunities to share information and dialogue would be fantastic. I think on the news a couple years ago or last year, I know it was a woman out east somewhere was having literally like these evening group sessions where people of all ages could come, but it ended up being exactly what you just talked about. Women that maybe have gone through it already, talking to younger women and helping to prepare and really sharing and being in community with one another was really what
Right.
it was about.
I find that a lot of women live in silos
Yeah.
and that they don't reach out to each other to share
Mhm.
what's going on with their bodies or their
Yep.
families and ask those questions.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely.
And this is Heidi again. I think I totally agree. The other thing I think is how do we kind of do some myth busting around hormone replacement?
Yep.
I remember when I was a new nurse that was associated with breast cancer, so nobody ever wanted to visit it or revisit it. And I think, some of the research has been updated to suggest that that's not necessarily the case, but the word hasn't gotten out.
Yeah. Exactly. Yep. and it is scary. Like you don't want to do anything wrong or hurt yourself or things like that. So, yeah, I think there's some definitely broader education that needs to be done as well. I think I saw Ori had her hand up if she's still available to chat.
Yeah, Robin, can you hear me?
I can, yes. Hi.
Hey, good evening. I mean, I just think it's so critically important, the work that you're doing, and especially, as we look at, think about NIH funding and
Mhm.
what a small percentage of funding, even when, pre this administration, the percentage, it was, even last year it was right around 10%.
Mhm.
And I think the fact that, we're seeing all of this funding for women and different areas cut. I just love the fact that nurses and you are starting to step into this space of picking up the torch for women's health and continuing to, advocate. So across the course of the next few years, that I would love to see nurses, in the work that you're leading, nurses step in and say, right, we didn't drop the ball. We've advanced the science. And I think that's incredibly powerful. So thanks for everything you're doing.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Thank you. It's very rewarding. And so I see it continuing to grow in multiple directions. I just don't feel like I just need to keep working harder and faster, but it will come.
Christy, did you want to say something about the VA data? You'd had something in the chat.
Oh yeah, I saw that. Okay. Maybe she stepped away, but yeah.
Maybe. Okay. So I have a question because I was on an ethics grand rounds from Colorado University today, and they were talking about autonomy and cultural differences in
Mhm.
autonomy, and it struck me during the conversation that they were having that they weren't talking about the cultural differences that the health system has, where their rules are the right rules, and and trying to understand the other, but that they never question their own view on autonomy. And so it made me wonder about cultural differences with menopause experience.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that there's that was brought up quite a bit too at the Menopause Society conference. And so how to have those conversations with individuals about, growing up with different beliefs around menopause or even medication, things like that. And so and there are differences. I think that there's just even in bone density differences between, different ethnic groups. And so I think it's very important to be able to address that and talk about it, and understand the risks, and that maybe higher at risk for osteoporosis or osteopenia, and how can you prevent that? What do we need to be doing in your 30s and 40s to help prevent having osteoporotic fractures later? Just one example, and I think too how mental health changes. I think that's another component, or but just I think we're just beginning to even crack the surface around understanding metabolic health and metabolic changes. I think that understanding like the musculoskeletal is severely impacted around the decreasing of estrogen, but what happens metabolically as well is just a whole nother area of science that's coming out, and being able to then really study these differences in a way that is I think robust enough to where we can have some conversations about it. Just like even trying to get to have women's health, our heart disease, understanding there are differences, and we can talk about that, and we need to be studying these differences. So when women have better understanding of how to care for themselves, same thing, I think, around cultural differences and having an understanding of what people are willing or not willing to do. But we can still do preventative measures, whether you want to take hormone therapy or not. Yeah, I think it's again education for the patients, but also providers, and being willing to have those conversations. That if someone comes in and says, "I'm having hot flashes, I don't really feel that great anymore, I'm having trouble sleeping," and women being reported that they're feeling gaslit. I mean, we can't. That's so old school. We can't do that anymore. We know that's not appropriate, um, and it's real. And just versus saying it's all in your head or this or that, and no,
Or so, of course.
right? Yep,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah.
Sorry, I
Good.
couldn't unmute. I couldn't figure out my phone. This is Christy.
Hi, Christy.
I totally agree with everything you're saying. It's so interesting, especially the musculoskeletal system is so important to, with the bone density, like you're saying, and like the hip pain and things like that, that women go through, that they don't even think that it's from menopause.
Right.
They just think it's from something else. And then we're finding, I just took a women's health position at the VA.
Hmm.
And I'm the navigator now. So we call all of our women veterans and make sure they're up on their yearly exams and stuff like that. And it's so interesting because I do see some that have a bone density exam done, but not a lot. And I feel like that's something that we should be doing even more.
I agree. Yeah, and I think right now too, I was reading, and maybe don't quote me if I'm wrong, is that some of like the scans are not really recommended till you're in your 60s. But I'm thinking, why don't you want to get it? And maybe it's insurance, right? That's kind of a policy issue as well. But understanding bone density much earlier, and we know as you go through menopause, you're going to lose at least 10 to 12% of your bone density just going through menopause. And by the time you're 80, I think you've lost 30% of your bone density. But there's things that we can be doing, earlier, much earlier, to help try to preserve some of that bone density. And even trying to just educate around that, I think
Yeah.
is a big deal. Yep, for
Have you
sure.
seen some, I'm wondering too, if there's any correlation between bone density and all the new drugs like Wegovy and Ozempic that are coming out, are they playing a factor on the bone density of these women?
That's a great question. I don't know, and maybe it's even too early to tell. I think some of the long-term ramifications are of some of the drugs later on. We don't know what.
Yeah.
Yep.
It just makes me wonder, because you're losing that weight and you're losing that muscle mass, and it then goes down into the bones, and I'm wondering how that's going to affect us also in the years to come.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's if you've heard of her name is Marie Claire Haver. She is a OBGYN. She's on social media quite a bit. I think she wrote a book just recently on menopause. I think we went to the New York Times bestseller. I do follow her because she is pretty evidence-based, and I think she does have some good insights, just kind of in general around menopause, but also well-being and what you can do to help combat bone loss, muscle mass, losing muscle mass, all of those things. And she says she's on a plan. She's like, I'm not on a plan just to be strong. I'm on a plan to keep me out of the long-term care facility. And which is kind of true, right? You want to make sure that you maintain your muscle mass, that you're not falling, like all those factors that we know that can be that great cascade, right? But she was saying if you are doing a GLP-1, that you have to be exercising and you have to be trying to maintain your muscle mass because it can have huge detrimental effects later on. So I was cluing in on some of the things that she was saying, but it'd be fantastic to know more. I haven't had a chance to dive into that, but I think that there definitely would be a correlation. Yep. Well, thank you all for your attention. This is a great conversation. I really appreciate it. And the feedback is great. If you think of something later, please reach out to me. If you didn't get my email from this, it'll be on the slides, but I can also be found on the School of Nursing faculty website as well under faculty. I'm in Austin, so it's right at the top of the alphabet.
I was going to say, I bet you're one of the first ones.
Pretty much.
Thank you so much, Robin. This was fascinating, and it's exciting knowing that you're doing this work. So keep us updated because we want to know more.
Absolutely. Happy to share more when we come out with some additional work. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Stay warm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely. Good night.
Good night.